O tihei Māori ora. He mihi ana ngā mana whenua ki tēnei takiwa. Kāti māmoe, a waitaha, a kaitahu whānui katoa, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ka runaka o tākou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. E nā mana e nā reo, rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei whakanui. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei kōrero. Welcome everybody. Ko Grant Robertson taku ingoa, ko na tumu whakarai ki o tāku whakaihu waka. I'm Grant Robertson, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural professorial lecture of Melanie Beres. That's our first clap that we give. Our official party today includes the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Pacific, Professor Diane Sika-Potonu, Professor Hugh Campbell, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Division of Humanities, Associate Professor Brindle Homan Marriott, the Head of Program for Sociology, Gender Studies and Criminology, and Professor Melanie Beres, who will deliver tonight's inaugural professorial lecture. I also want to acknowledge in the room all of you, but I especially want to acknowledge, he said scanning the room, for Fraser Barton from the University Council, who I believe is due to join us here tonight. But all of you are special guests. Rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. The other special guest that I want to acknowledge tonight is Melanie's family. I particularly want to acknowledge Melanie's wife Louise and their teen Echo. I won't tell my story, I'll save it. There's a story. I want to acknowledge Mel's parents, Matt and Mark, who are visiting from Canada, her in-laws Jeff and Jan Pearman, and online, hello online, sister Kim and brother-in-law Rick and nieces Cashlyn and Carrera. We all know that achieving in your career, whatever it is, requires sacrifice both from you and from your whānau. That is especially so in an academic career. And the sacrifices that have been made by Mel's family, I want to recognise tonight. Thank you for your support for Melanie, for the work that you've done over the years to help her achieve her goals. As a university, we are grateful to you for your sacrifice and your contribution to Melanie's career. Can we please show our appreciation to Mel's family? To all of Melanie's colleagues, many of whom I see here in the room tonight, thank you too for your work. To her students and those that have worked and inspired her, thank you as well. And for the wider university community and wider community represented here, you are most welcome. Nau mai, haere mai. Achieving promotion to professor is a milestone landmark in the career of academics. It does not happen easily. It requires sustained commitment and excellence across three spheres, and I know this will be referred to by other speakers as well. That is in teaching, in research, and in service. Melanie exemplifies excellence in all of those areas, be it in the research that is translated into public policy change, be it in the teaching that has inspired hundreds of students, including those that Melanie has supervised. But in my brief remarks, I want to talk about Melanie's service to the university. She currently has the formal title of Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor Humanities, the informal title of which is Manager, Hugh Campbell. That in itself would merit promotion in my view. But I know from the work that I've been privileged to do with Mel over the last period of time just what an exceptional service she provides to our university. She has a level of wisdom, of compassion, and of commitment that I believe is the gold standard of our university. So from me, Mel, thank you so much for your work in service of our university, in addition to the work that you do in service of the community and your teaching and your research. So again, my job is done. I have welcomed you all here. Please enjoy the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Melanie Beres. It now falls to me to hand over to Associate Professor Brindle Homan Marriott to introduce Mel. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, ko Brindalaho. I'm delighted to be given this honor of introducing Melanie. I'm not going to go on and on. I've been given a short one. Melanie, in fact, specifically requested me to do this in interpretive dance, but I don't think I'm going to be needing that, although maybe I'll tear up and I'll need to resort to that. But I'll try to use words and be quick. I wanted to just say two specific things that are based on my experience in working with Melanie, co-teaching, co-researching, sharing lots of conversations, co-supervising, all the different things. So believe me when I'm very, very sincere in saying that one of the things that I find most impressive is how Melanie brings things together and bridges. And I'm saying that in terms of the research because you don't have to be a complete methods geek like I am to appreciate how you bring research methods all together and bridge those various different approaches. Also bridging research and teaching, bridging research and working with communities, bridging communities with each other. And that's something I particularly appreciate about what you've done, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that now. And the other thing that I just wanted to use myself as a bit of an example in saying how impactful your work has been. All of those conversations and listening to your work in seminars, it's shaped the way I've thought about consent. It's shaped the way I've taught about this topic. It's shaped the way I've researched it, the way I've looked at it. Personally, it's shaped the way I've parented my kids. It's shaped the way I read novels. So to the extent that relationships are important to everything we do, consent's important to relationships, consent's important to everything in life. So I really look forward to hearing more about that.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko yamnaska te maunga, te rune taku nakau, ko ofio te awa e mahia ne aku mā hara no Canada aho, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehi, o otipoti o noho ne o, ko Melanie Tokuingoa. No reira, tēnā koutou. Sorry, I just saw my dad tear up and now it's getting me. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Grant, for the very warm welcome, and Brindle for the lovely introduction. Brindle is one of the first people I connected with when I moved here, so it's quite fitting, I think, that she was able to introduce me today. Giving this lecture feels very self-indulgent, so thank you all for spending some time out of your evening to come here and to listen to me talk. As I was planning this talk, I was really grappling with finding the balance between the personal stories and the professional research. And because my work focuses on sexual consent and preventing sexual violence, I'm mindful that these topics can be quite sensitive as well. And so the way I kind of managed that is I made lots of slides with lots of pictures of the people who really helped me along the way. And then I will speak more to both the progression of my academic career. So when I say my pipiha, my introduction at the beginning, I always say that Yamnuska is the mountain that speaks to my heart. And I'm very aware that here in Aotearoa, people have no idea where that Yamnuska is. So this is Yamnuska. It's a mountain that's on the east end of the Canadian Rockies. It's the first face that you see as you're going from Calgary in towards Banff. And it really is the mountain that speaks to my heart. I've spent countless nights camping at the bottom of the mountain. I have summited the mountain. I've climbed the face of the mountain, tramped in behind it. I've even spent a night in the little col that you can't see on the side, melting snow to drink because there was no water source around. It is the mountain that grounds me. And so I just wanted to share it with you today. If you're wondering where my slightly unpronounceable last name comes from, it's Hungarian. And I just wanted to share a little bit to you about the geography. Being here in Aotearoa has really encouraged me to reflect on my place in the world and my geography, and so I wanted to share with you a bit about where I come from. My dad grew up in a small town in what was then Yugoslavia, what's now Serbia, along the river Danube. And my mom grew up in another small town on the eastern coast of Canada called Marguerite Forks on Cape Breton Island. And just as an FYI, Alexander Graham Bell says that Cape Breton Island is the most beautiful place in the world. So take it on good authority that that's the case. My parents met in Vancouver, on the other side of Canada, and I was born in Uranium City, a tiny little town in northern Saskatchewan. And yes, it really was named for the uranium mine that used to be there. So this is me in Uranium City. So Hugh, these are the childhood photos that you requested. You can see it got quite cold there. So now that I've situated myself a bit in place, I want to move on to a little bit about how my academic career evolved. And no, that's not a mistake. It does say a budding biochemist on purpose. And so I really want to acknowledge some people who started me on this journey, and this is where it began. So this is my grade 11, I think year 12 biology teacher, Mrs. Jane Dyke. She came to me one day and noticed that I was really excited and interested in science. And so she said that her niece was doing a master's degree in biochemistry at the university, and she wondered if maybe I would want to go and volunteer in the lab there and learn a bit about science. And so I really leapt at the opportunity. It was Merrick's lab, Merrick Michaela, his lab that Carrie worked in. And so I'd go there every Wednesday and volunteer in the lab, doing various things like photocopying articles, but also running assays. And Shiraz Baksh, who was a PhD student at the time, really took me under his wing. And one of the most important things that I learned from Shiraz is how to read an academic article. And spoiler alert, you don't read it from beginning to end. Right? And that actually has helped me throughout my academic career, those kind of little tidbits of knowledge. I also spent a summer at Oxford University working under Rodney Phillips. There I was sequencing peptides of the HIV virus, because we were tracking mutations in the lab. And he also gave me the task over the summer of writing a review article to review the evidence that supports the idea that cytotoxic T cells recognize short viral peptides bound to HLA class 1 molecules. Don't ask me what that means, I can't remember, right? But I know I wrote it because there's the photo evidence. So these experiences convinced me that I was going to become a biochemistry professor. And so third year university came around, and in Canada, your undergrad is 4 years. And I remember so clearly walking into my first immunology lecture, and I was so excited to be there. And then by the end of it, I was sitting there thinking, I'm in the wrong place. And it really was that quick. It sounds really dramatic, but in that moment, I knew science wasn't for me. Because if this is the class that I'd been so excited to take and it wasn't resonating for me, I needed to leave. I was really terrified to tell Merrick that I was leaving science. By that point, I'd been in his lab for probably about 4 years. And so I remember the day I went and told him I was leaving science. And he looked at me and he said, Melanie, every morning I wake up, I drink my coffee, I read the newspaper, and I look forward to going to work. And if you can't say the same thing, you're in the wrong place. My first thought through my head was, I don't drink coffee, honestly. But his words and his kindness really stuck with me. And so while I left science, these early experiences really fostered my curiosity, my drive for knowledge, and really taught me how to think through problems. After leaving science, I had no real clear idea of what my future looked like. I thought I'd go to Australia for a year and jaunt around. I'm sorry to say New Zealand wasn't on the list. But then in the meantime, I started volunteering at the Sexual Assault Center at the University of Alberta. And I started there because I knew I wanted to help people. I had done peer support in high school. And the options at the university were this or the peer support center. And I thought that the Sexual Assault Center would be the more challenging place to be. What I didn't expect was for that training to be so transformative. I trained as a crisis worker and then as a program facilitator. Through volunteering there, I discovered the human ecology program and ended up doing a bachelor in human ecology. Human ecology is the study of humans and their near environments. It's a combination of psychology, sociology, anthropology. We even had professors who were chemists and anthropologists. It was a practical degree, so, and I've really kept, I think, the learning from that has really shaped my teaching. It's probably why I feel such affinity to social workers. And after that degree, I can call myself a professional home economist, if I wanted to at any point. So while I was doing my degree, I worked part-time at the Sexual Assault Center. I went from facilitator to program coordinator, started developing workshops and programs and training other facilitators. I was also on the executive of the North American Student Coalition Against Sexual Violence, and was able to travel to various conferences across North America, talking with other students about how to prevent sexual violence. And so here are some of the photos. And for any, this is one of the foremost, bell hooks, one of the foremost sort of feminist icons, really, who did a lot of work in this space, and I was fortunate enough to meet her. So when I finally graduated 7 years later, I kept thinking about my experiences at the Sexual Assault Center and facilitating workshops. And it was the concept of consent that I always came back to. It was because it was always the contentious part of our workshops. People would often engage quite readily with many of the other ideas that we talked about. But whenever it talked about consent, particularly the Canadian law on consent at the time, that's what brought up a whole lot of questions and challenges. And so I wanted to know more, and I realized that often when we were talking about consent, we were talking from a framework of what happens when things go wrong. And I wanted to know, well, what happens when things go right? What about relationships where everything goes well? And what can we learn from those that can help inform violence prevention? So I did go to the literature, and I can say hand on heart, there were only 3 studies at the time that were looking specifically at the behavioral kind of understanding and lay understanding around consent. There was literature in philosophy and in legal studies that grappled with the concept of consent, but very little that focused on that human interaction. So off I went to the University of Guelph to do a master's in family relations and human development, where I wanted to learn more about how people engage in consensual relationships. Initially, I wanted to do qualitative work. It seemed to me the obvious place to start, considering that little was known about how consent was communicated. I had also been working as a research assistant for the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, where I learned the basics of qualitative research there and thought that it would be useful. But when I arrived at Guelph, it turned out that the only lecturer there who had experience in qualitative methods was on sabbatical that year. So I pivoted and decided to take advantage of the expertise that was there, and I decided to learn quantitative methods. So I decided to replicate one of the existing few studies that was focused on heterosexual young adults, and instead do this similar study with gay and lesbian participants. So the study consisted of asking participants to rate various behaviors on how frequently they were used to indicate consent in terms of 2 contexts, both initiating sex and responding to others' initiations. So I learned how to do, first of all, factor analysis, which distilled those scales into different concepts. I'm not going to go too far into all the ins and outs. But then I learned structural equation modeling, and this is a structural equation model here, to better understand how the different groups use the different cues. So to not go into too much detail in here, what I learned, and one of the things I learned, is that from participants' perspectives, there was no distinction between initiating and responding behaviors. That was all kind of one. There's other things as well, but I won't bore you with the statistics. But it's fair to say that it was this that really taught me to love statistics and structural equation modeling in particular. And luckily, when I came here, Brindle and I have many good conversations about it. So on the advice of one of my mentors after I was finished my master's, pictured here, Jen Morse, who was the director of the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, I took a PhD in sociology. She suggested sociology for two reasons. One, because of the strong theoretical background, but the other reason was because it had stronger disciplinary foundation and would likely open up more academic job opportunities for me, which I think she was right. So what I'm going to do now is the PhD really kicked off a series of studies, and so I'm going to quickly sort of track the trajectory of the studies, and then I will delve more into the findings across all of them rather than looking at them all individually. So I returned to the University of Alberta for this time to do a PhD in sociology. My supervisors were Lise Gautel and Amy Kaler. Lise is a socio-legal scholar focusing on consent, and Amy is a qualitative researcher focused on sexuality. So really, I came back to that first question that I had after my bachelor's degree, looking at how do people understand consent, and how does consent work in relationships. So I designed a qualitative study, and I wanted to focus specifically on casual relationships because I wanted to focus on relationships where they couldn't rely on a lot of prior knowledge of each other. So I went to Jasper, Alberta. You can think of Jasper as a bit like the Wanaka to like the Queenstown. So Jasper is to Banff what Wanaka is to Queenstown, right? So a resort community north of Banff that has a lot of seasonal workers in the summer. And there I interviewed 21 young people about how they understood consent, particularly to their casual relationships. During that time, read Nicola Gavi's book, Just Sex, The Cultural Scaffolding of Rape. So as that project was finished up, I asked her very nicely if she would take me on as a postdoc. And she, to my surprise, said yes. So I thought coming down here to Aotearoa, I was in the University of Auckland in this time the Department of Psychology, and was able to work with her. And the main study that I conducted at the time was an extension of my PhD, but this time with established couples, asking them the same kind of questions. The most exciting thing about my postdoc was that I became a parent as well, which was very exciting for me. And then after postdoc, I was lucky enough to get a job here at Ataka Whakaihu Waka, and my return to sociology. And it's here that in the first few years I conducted a study with queer adults, asking them very much the same questions that I asked during my PhD and postdoc. Just as I was finishing up that study, I received an email from someone who was so confident in what they were saying that they sent it anonymously. And they told me that I should be ashamed of myself. And they sent me a link to an article, and it was an article from the Toronto Sun. So it turns out that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who probably had too much time on their hands, had decided that my PhD study was the biggest waste of taxpayers' money. They dressed someone up in a pig costume and a cap and gown and went to the Parliament Hill and presented the graduation award and a big kind of check for $17,000 and change to my study. Although actually it was $70,000 that the Canadian government paid for the PhD rather than 17, so they didn't quite get that right. So now let's see what that waste of taxpayers' money sort of accomplished. And now I'm going to delve a little bit into the results across the research from that time period. These are sort of quintessential photos of sexual violence prevention from the 90s. No means no was a popular slogan, as were tips for women. So consent, as it's generally understood, is, I think, first and foremost a legal concept that's used to distinguish sexual violence from sex that is not sexual violence. And it is generally defined as some form of agreement to engage in the activities that take place. We can get a bit more nuanced and talked about it being a free agreement, being absent from coercion. Most laws in most jurisdictions have something around capacity to consent, or including not being overly drunk or being sober, right? So this is kind of the beginning of consent. And what I wanted to understand across the board were how people practice this in their everyday life. And I was very aware, especially early on, consent was it wasn't a concept that was out there, right? You don't really see that in here. And so I didn't want people's perceptions of that word consent to really shape their answers in interviews. So in the first parts of the interviews, I didn't use the word consent at all. I asked them questions about how they agree. So how do you know? How do you know that the person that you're engaging with wants to be there? How do you show them that you too want to be there? And so the conversations often start with social conventions. So if I go back with someone after the bar, then that means that it's a yes. And so then I would say, well, are there any times that you've gone home with someone and that hasn't happened? And they would say yes. And I would say, okay, well, what's the difference? And then they would talk a lot about absence of refusal. So there was and they would talk not just about that in that kind of blunt way, but talk actually in quite nuanced ways about hesitation and about discomfort and about how they kind of understood and read discomfort or hesitation, and that would be a sign to shift and to change and to do something, or to ask and to bring it up. And so then I said, okay, so if you don't have any signs of refusal, does that mean that everything's copacetic? And they said no, that it's not just that. It's also someone who's showing that they're actively participating and engaging and actively being there. In the couple studies, it was really cute. Some couples talked about little conventions that they had, like, oh, I'd leave the bedside table light on when I'm in the mood, or things like that. And sometimes they realized that in the interview, they're like, I didn't know that this is why I did this, but on reflection, this is what's going on, right? And so, yeah, and another thing that particularly in the study with queer adults that they talked about was this notion of tuning in and of being in tune. And they talked about what that looks like and what it looks like when someone is tuning out as well. And that this is not to say that everyone always got it right, but it was seeing consent as relational, right? And that seeing it as relational opens up options sometimes for repair. Communication is complex, and sometimes people misread. But what marked their stories in terms of ethical practice was the willingness to respond when new information arrives, right? And that's distinct from situations where signs of hesitation are treated as obstacles to overcome. And so, for instance, while most stories were consistent with the above in terms of detailed information and knowing, I remember clearly one participant who, in qualitative terms, we would call a negative case, who had quite a different kind of story. And he said to me, he's like, you never ask directly. You never say anything. And he described to me how he would pick up on signs of discomfort or signs of hesitation. But he said rather than asking about that, because that could just kill it, you back off and you try again, right? And so his story, I think, also reinforced this notion that the problem wasn't that he was unable to read, but the problem was that he was doing something different. So most participants gave quite nuanced answers. And then when I asked them about consent, and so I'd say, well, what does consent mean to you? The answers suddenly became really flat. Consent was a one-off event. Consent is when she doesn't say no. consent, or someone said you don't knock at your own house when it came to long-term relationships. And one participant dubbed consent the butt lift. I'll leave it to you to figure that one out. So consent is a minimum requirement then, and not a relational practice. And so these answers to consent were such a huge contrast to what the participants themselves had said to me before. And if I had started the interviews asking about consent, right, I would have concluded that these people have no idea what they're doing, that they need a whole heck of a lot of education, and that we need to start giving it to them, right? So when I started research on consent, it was a little used concept. By the time I was doing my queer study, it became quite ubiquitous, and it became the concept that is used in sexual violence prevention. It just kind of exploded, and here's some of the messages that were that existed at the time. As consent campaigns proliferated across campus, the posters really taught an instruction set, right? Only yes means yes, ask every time. Their visual grammar was didactic and list-like, bright icons, tick boxes, framing consent as a simple algorithm to be executed correctly. Many materials also use corrective slogans, like clothes aren't consent, flirting isn't consent, twerking does not mean yes, right? Casting audiences as uninformed and positioning explicit verbalization as the single trustworthy route to knowing. This net effect narrowed what is a complex and relational practice into a scripted checklist, even as people in my studies described attunement, context, and consistency between words and actions as central to ethical sex. And this is where I came across the concept of agnotology, which is the study of ignorance. And it really helped me think through this, right? So agnotology, or often when we think about ignorance, we think about an absence of knowledge, right? Just something, you just haven't been given the opportunity to know something, and there is just kind of this hole that needs to be filled. Agnotology as a sort of way of studying ignorance positions ignorance as something that is created. So it's not merely the absence of something. Ignorance isn't just happenstance, it's not a mistake. It's actually the creation of a void of knowledge in a particular place. And I think consent, as it is often produced in here, is a real clear example of a form of agnotology. So when education and some research treat explicit verbal statements as the only trustworthy way of knowing, they inadvertently are creating ignorance, a worldview where anything less than a scripted yes is treated as unknowable, ambiguous, and unsafe. That stance erases the careful ethical ways that people do know, and it also sends messages to young people that they don't know anything about consent, nor should they expect their partner to know anything. And it leaves place for people to exploit these rules and to claim confusion, even when there might not be. So taken together, these studies form the basis of what I see as my central contribution to the understanding of consent. Across a range of relationships, my work demonstrates that people possess rich, embodied relational knowledge about willingness, knowledge that is systematically downplayed or erased in dominant consent, education, and prevention focused solely on consent. So by showing how consent education and social marketing can often produce ignorance, I argue that we have misunderstood the problem. Consent is not simply a matter of teaching people the right words, and sexual violence prevention is not just a matter of teaching people how to ask or how to communicate about sex. What we really need to do is start building prevention approaches that honor, strengthen, and guide that knowing that is already there. And so in part, to be really frank, my frustration at the explosion of consent-based prevention led me to start thinking about and engaging in other forms of research as well, and starting to do things a little bit differently. In 2016, early in the year, students published an open letter in the ODT, calling out the university and talking about their experiences of sexual harassment on and around campus. I remember going into Hugh's office, I don't know if he remembers this, but asking him how I might be able to help or whether or not the university would be interested in working together to support and try to address the issue. He suggested I write to the then PVC Tony Ballantyne, and honestly, within minutes of writing to him, I got a note from the Vice Chancellor's office asking me to meet with her. It was Harlene Hayne was the Vice Chancellor at the time. So at the same time, student activist groups were forming. Students were speaking up about their experiences and demanding better systems of support and prevention. Harlene established 2 different working groups, and I was focused, did a lot of work with the group focusing on support and prevention. And we started, and one thing that was really clear to me, and people kept asking me at the time for a consent program, and what was clear to me is that we needed far more than just a consent program. We needed to develop a whole campus approach that involved staff and students, professional staff, academic staff, that involved good policy, support, and a range of education and prevention. So I think in 2017, Harlene asked me to write a business case. I'd never written a business case before. I was like, okay. So I did, and I'm deeply grateful for her trust and the opportunity to design something that I hoped would genuinely change students' lives. Writing that business case drew together 3 separate reports around support, prevention, and a policy report, and proposed not only a support center, but a comprehensive evidence-based prevention portfolio, staff training, and a strong research and evaluation spine. In a way, for me, it really felt like it had come full circle. I started and developed my passion for this work at the University of Alberta Sexual Assault Centre, and now years later, I was able to help build a centre of our own. Tafade Tafado's design is inspired directly by the University of Alberta model and includes, for instance, student volunteers and students working there, because I figure in a university institution, I wanted to provide an opportunity for students also to learn and grow in that space that I found so valuable. To call the first couple of years a trial by fire would be a gross understatement. And what I will say is that those early years were hard. And I don't mean just busy hard and challenging hard. They were both of those things. But I also mean the kind of hard that shakes one to its core. To their core. When you work in a space shaped by trauma, it's not uncommon for people to project their fears or pain onto whoever is most visible. And because I was the person building a new structure inside of this institution, I sometimes found myself cast into roles or motives that weren't mine at all. At the same time, there were real tensions between those working against the institution from the outside and calling for accountability, and the path that I had chosen, which was to work within the institution to build something lasting. Both approaches are important, and sitting in that middle space can be really uncomfortable. You can end up absorbing a lot of heat from both directions, but what really sustained me was the belief that change requires work on every front, and that creating Tafade Tafado from the inside was one way that I could really contribute to making things better for students. Working with Tafade Tafado also allowed me to collaborate with Gareth Trahan and Jeff Foote. I learned systems thinking, and I started to really think about shifting prevention towards a more systems approach, which means looking at the entire kind of complex system, whether it's the university or the country. And just in case you haven't noticed, many of you would know Jordan Doherty. She was one of the first staff members at Tafade Tafado, and she just started her PhD working with me about a month ago. So we're continuing to work together. So after several years focused on campus level work, my prevention work, I started to expand and think more nationally. The Ministry of Social Development government commissioned me to write a literature review on healthy youth relationships. A lit review that then ended up being the foundation for what is now Love Better, which is a national social marketing campaign for teens and young adults that is not focused on consent, but focused on some real issues that young people are grappling with in their relationships. Subsequently, Nicola Gavi invited me to become involved in a project that I'm enormously proud of and enormously kind of fortunate to join, which is a project we've titled Mobilizing Aotearoa to Prevent Sexual Violence. It's grounded in a T2DT framework. I led the Tangata Tiriti side, where we were looking at developing models to support communities in community-based prevention. And we worked alongside the Tangata Whenua team, who were doing the same in Kaupapa Māori and Māori communities. So I got to work with Nicola again, alongside Jordan, and also a colleague from Auckland, Chris Taylor. And we worked alongside Terry Dobbs, who led the Tangata Whenua team, along with Charlotte Moore, Jade Legreese, and Logan Hamley. And the result of that has just been published through VINE, which is Violence Information Aotearoa, and it's basically a roadmap for community groups to develop prevention programs on their own, ones that are locally situated. So as I wrap up, here's a few reflections on my career and a few notes. My first few years in biochemistry, way back when, taught me how to think in very particular ways. Taught me how to analyze problems systematically, follow evidence, and reason like a scientist, aka a positivist. In my later studies, I learned to question some of the assumptions behind that way of thinking and to work from different epistemological positions. Being able to move between these ways of knowing, I think, has become one of my strengths, both as a researcher and more recently as a leader. When it comes to consent, here is a prediction. I think the concept has hit its use-by date. And I think we're going to start seeing some shifts in prevention. From the instances of its proliferation, I had concerns, and I'm not the only one by any stretch. But now I'm also hearing stories from young people in my classrooms about how consent feels like a tick box exercise, and it feels rote, and it doesn't actually address the problem. And so what is coming next on the prevention front is, I think, a lot of the systems work that I started talking about here. Sexual violence prevention started as a grassroots movement, and there's real strengths to that approach. And now we're seeing a shift towards integrating and whole school and community approaches, and bringing grassroots community work in with evidence-based and university kind of work as well. We did publish the Otago model and how we set up Te Whare Tawharo. It was shortlisted for the Best Article Award in Higher Education Policy and Management. And I've heard from universities around the world, even University of Galway brought me out there in 2024. And it was very humbling to have them present what they were doing, which was based on the model that we developed here. At the broader level as well, a project that I'm really excited about is working with high schools. So there's 4 Dunedin high schools who approached me a couple of years ago, and we've started a community of practice. And if you had told me 5 years ago that this would happen, to be honest, I don't know that I would have believed you, but it's all 3 boys' schools and one of the girls' schools in town that are on board, and we've been working together now for 2 years and starting to really gain some traction and making some meaningful change. And that was my message to them when we started. This is going to be slow. It is not going to be fast. It is not about bringing in speakers or doing workshops. Meaningful change takes time, and it's great to see that happening and shifting. Finally, as many of you know, I've taken up other leadership roles around the university. I really enjoy being challenged in new ways and learning new things. And it's also given me a bit of a reprieve from working in the spaces of trauma. But my experience at Te Whare Tawharo has given me a fair bit of perspective about what's really important in life. And I can honestly think I say I no longer sweat the small stuff. And it's all small stuff, right? And so just some thank yous. Firstly, to some key mentors, Lise Gotel, Charlene Sen, Nicola Gavi. In various ways, they have all led by example as pioneering feminist scholars in the space of sexual violence prevention. It's been a great honor to learn from them and to work with them. Hugh, I don't know whether you realize just how much a mentor you've been to me, but Hugh became my head of program in my second year here, and I've always appreciated his guidance and his advice and the way that he situated our department within the broader university context. To my New Zealand family who have welcomed me with open arms, the aunties and uncles up in Auckland, you've really helped make Aotearoa feel like home to me. To my in-laws, Jeff and Jan, thank you for your support over the years with advice, house renos, and gardening. It's made being away from Canada a little bit easier. To my parents, Matt and Marg. Dad, I don't think I realized until just recently where my drive for justice comes from. Despite the fact that my mom used to tell me how much I was like my dad almost on a daily basis. But thank you so much for being a great example. Mom, thank you for teaching me to trust myself even when others were telling me otherwise. To echo, the greatest honor of my life is being your mom, and you've been my greatest teacher. And finally, to Louise, you've been a constant source of steadiness and clarity, someone who sees me clearly, keeps me grounded, and reminds me of who I am when the work gets heavy. You've picked up more than your fair share behind the scenes so that I could show up for others, and have always done that with generosity, patience, and belief in me. I am deeply grateful for you and your partnership in every sense of the word. So thank you all for sitting through and listening. It was very humbling, and I think that's me finished.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa, ko Hugh Campbell toku ingoa, ko ao te manakura o te kete ara nui. So my name is Hugh Campbell, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Division of Humanities. Carefully managed Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Division of Humanities. So for those of you who attend many of these events, you'll know that the duties of the Pro-Vice Chancellor are to pass on the congratulations of the university's senior management and to welcome the speaker into the ranks of the Professorial. And I've had the privilege of doing that many times in my current role, but tonight is slightly different because I'm not only addressing Melanie as her Pro-Vice Chancellor, she's also been my sociology colleague and friend for almost the entirety of her time at the university. So I'm going a little off-piste tonight. I'm sorry, Grant, just start waving when it's time's up. We don't want to burn the sausage rolls over at the staff club. Look, I want to speak very briefly for what Melanie's career to date means for, I think tonight what we've seen is it's a milestone for herself, but I also want to speak briefly as a milestone for the discipline of sociology in New Zealand and for the teaching of sociology at the University of Otago. So I'll dig into the memory banks and dig out a file titled Crises and Debates in the Discipline of Sociology in the years 2000 to 2010, and out will come a particular file titled what might be called the Relevancy Crisis in Sociology. So about 20 to 25 years ago, when Melanie was first starting her PhD at the University of Alberta, sociology conferences took on this weird tonality, is that we were meeting in corners and going, I'm really worried we've lost our relevance. We'd been through about a 20-year binge of massively florid theorising, something I personally benefited from myself. And we sort of reached this point where sort of a hangover was starting to come in, and we were asking, is sociology relevant? Do we do relevant things in the world? And by 2005, we'd collectively landed in a discipline where a lot of academic social scientists were laying out their shingle based on adherence to or expertise in some very challenging theoretical areas. And don't get me wrong, I love social theory, but we were asking the question, have we become a little too abstract? And sort of the crisis of the time was, can we find our relevance again? And can we mix theory and method and relevance together to give sociology the future it needs in a place like New Zealand? When I think of the ways in which in the subsequent 25 years sociology and the wider social sciences have risen to the relevancy challenge, one person's work comes immediately to mind, and I'm delighted that we are honouring her here tonight. Relevancy crisis in New Zealand? Meet Melanie Beres. Look, I think Melanie's done an excellent job of telling the significance of her career and her work. What I will simply say, my takeaway point from her description of her work is that I'll be looking out for other PhD students in Canada who have been condemned by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Clearly they have a strong track record for being utterly wrong about the value and importance of what we do as scholars. The second milestone I want to call out is about the relatively short history of sociology at Otago. The sociology program at the University of Otago turns 25 this year, which in university terms is very young indeed. Prior to 2021, senior academics blocked the introduction of sociology for 30 years at the university. Those of us who were making the case for Otago sociology 25 years ago, well, the TLDR version of the case we were making to Senate and faculty at the time was, the 21st century is going to be epic. We are going to need sociology to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Melanie was the fourth person hired into sociology in a permanent position after Leslie Proctor, Martin Tolich and Brindleholm and Marion. And in your time, Melanie, you've made a remarkable contribution to the story of sociology here. So on behalf of the discipline, I want to say thank you for choosing to come to us. Thank you for the many students you've inspired in the classroom. By multiple accounts, your teaching has genuinely changed the lives of students trying to find insight and understanding in an area that is so poorly served in public discourse. Thank you for your incredibly relevant research and for your mahi that you did with Harlene Hain in setting up Te Whare Tawharo and the difficult and fraught venture that turned out to be. I think that was a massive risk in 2018, but now is increasingly normalised as what we expect to be able to provide as a university in terms of support for our students. Many other intervention programs are well, including the Ministry of Social Development, but where I would conclude is saying that you are exactly the kind of academic we hoped would emerge in response to the relevancy crisis of sociology. And I think we'd all have been much less fretful 25 years ago if we'd have been able to see you coming down the track in a crystal ball. And more than that, you've also fulfilled the deepest wishes of a small group of academics who fought to get sociology introduced at this university. If we could have pulled out that same crystal ball and shown the doubters a sneak preview of tonight's event, I think the task would have been much easier a quarter of a century ago. So, back to the normal script. Melanie, on behalf of the university leadership, I congratulate you on the attainment of our highest academic office, full professor at the University of Otago. I congratulate your family and your wider community of scholars and all the people you have inspired and organised to change people's lives in many positive ways. As a representative of the university's leadership, I am proud to welcome you officially to the ranks of the Professoriate and for us now to be considered your peers. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. small gift for you. Please join me in congratulating again Professor Melanie Beres.